Let's share a word of prayer together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of all our hearts, be pleasing and strengthening to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This kind of out-of-body text that our readers shared for us today came to us probably around 600 BCE, is kind of what we think. Babylonian exile time. And kind of the mindset, to kind of give you a little idea of trying to kind of distance yourself all the way back to that time period, is kind of interesting, because the conception of God at 600 BCE was location bound. So when they would say, I worship the God of Jacob and the God of Isaac and the God of Abraham, they are identifying a God to a particular territory or a land. And so they didn't really have a monotheistic mindset back then. There was a polytheistic mindset. Gods were all over the place, but my God resided in this particular landscape, this particular geography. And for God's people, their God resided in Jerusalem. And their God had a home, which was the temple. And when they got exiled out of Israel into Babylon, and when they crossed over the boundary of what we would consider Israel into Babylon, they basically we're saying goodbye to our God. We're crossing over the boundary. We no longer have access to the God that we believed in, because this God we believed in is back there. It's no longer over here. And it's hard for us to conceive that's how they thought of God, but that's how they understood. God was territorial in a sense. And so you imagine a whole group of people that have been kind of carted away from their homeland and placed in a new land altogether would have been a depressing experience for them. There is a psalm that I want to reference, Psalm 137. And the Babylonians are encouraging the people from Israel to sing some of their songs of their homeland. And this is the response of the psalmist. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept, when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. How can we sing our songs in a strange land? How can we sing a song to God when God's not going to even hear it? That's the context that we find God's people in. And Ezekiel, who was with them in Babylon, decides to take a little side trip. He decides he needs a little time away from the people, needs a little alone time. And he makes his way down to the river Kibar, which is one of the tributaries that connects to the Euphrates River. And he sits there along the river, and as he looks out across the water, he begins to see what Maureen and Donetta read to us, and had this epiphany, this vision, this experience, like, what in the world am I seeing? And oftentimes it appeared like, Ezekiel had no words to fully capture. Human language was kind of almost like a limitation, because there wasn't the right words to capture what it was that Ezekiel was seeing and visualizing right before him on the edges of the Kibar River. One of the things we know about people, and people that are religious, is we like what's comfortable and we like what's predictable. When I come in on Sunday morning, I'm going to hear Cindy sing and hear that beautiful guitar. Or when I come in, I know there may be a little moment of silence. I know when I get toward the end of service, we're going to celebrate communion. I know there's something about when I come to worship, there's something comfortable and predictable about my experience when I come. But at the same time, if I get so wrapped up in that comfort and predictability, I limit the possibilities of what me and we can experience about God's love, about God's presence, about God's experience. I'm a firm believer that in 600 BC, 587 to be exact, that particular time in history was a paradigm shift for humanity and God's people. And when a paradigm shift happens, it is an unsettling experience for people. You have to totally revamp, reimagine what it means when a paradigm completely shifts. Phyllis Tickle talked about that in The Great Emergence. Said about every 500-600 years, there is a major paradigm shift in human history. I would say that we're in one of those paradigm shifts right now. All we have to do is look at the news yesterday and the event that happened in Pennsylvania. People want comfort, they want predictability, and everyone's sense of comfort and predictability seems to be thrown out the door. There are some people that we've gotten way too progressive, we need to pull back. And other people, we've not gotten progressive enough for how we welcome and include and be hospitable to one another. And it seems as though when there's a paradigm shift, those that want to keep the paradigm the same grab hold of that, want to kind of capture it, hold it, and don't want it to change at all. And those that are leaning into the paradigm shift or wanting something new but not quite sure what that new is going to be. Ezekiel found himself at that paradigm shift. And there's one discovery Ezekiel found out about this grand vision of these winged creatures with these interesting faces of a human being and an ox and an eagle and all these different things there. And then you have this description of this mechanism that this winged creature rides on. There's wheels and wheels within wheels. I mean, it's a crazy description. But one of the things that Ezekiel pulls out of this vision for God's people in Babylon was that God had come to them in their exile. They had thought that God was bound by land and by location. Ezekiel's vision of what he saw was that God is no longer bound by those things. It's easy enough for us to say, God is everywhere. God is in me. God is in you. God is out there in the world. But in 587, that's not how they thought. They thought God had promised them a land, and they had built a temple for God to have a resting place. And they were not near either of those two experiences. This idea that John Berquist says, if there's anything we get out of this chapter 1, is two words: God moves. God shifts. As much as we want God to be predictable, God is anything but. As soon as God becomes predictable, it becomes we as human beings have now captured an image of God that we don't want to change because it makes us comfortable. As soon as there's this new idea about God, new idea about how God works in the world, we kind of resistant to that. We don't want that to happen because it shakes up everything we believe, everything we put together in terms of our faith package of how I understand my faith and living in the world. As soon as new information comes in, how do I process that, make that different when I'm not sure I want to allow that new information into my being, into my soul? Ezekiel has the prophetic opportunity to take a people that are grieving and hurting a loss of God's presence, saying, you'll never guess what I just saw. You may think God was back home, our homeland, but God is right here with us, inviting us into something new. And one of the hard things about paradigm shifts is it creates sometimes the worst behaviors. Divisive behaviors, mean behaviors, violent behaviors, all with the idea that we want to maintain homeostasis, calm. But those behaviors do anything but. Martin Luther King Jr. said that violence only begets violence. If we want love, only love begets love. Violence is not the path if we want something new and different in the world. In this paradigm shift, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about this phrase. I've mentioned it once before, but we think about in the Lord's Prayer, we say, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Martin Luther King Jr. called that the beloved community. And the beloved community has several traits. You can look online. There's 25 traits to how we would describe the beloved community. Part of those traits of the beloved community is that we see in each person the image of God. Every person, even the person we vehemently disagree with. Like, how can you even believe that? Or take the notion of that idea and think that's true for yourself. That each person has within them the image of God. That no one person or group holds all ultimate truth. There is always new truth to be imagined, to be experienced, and to be learned. That the beloved community does not work toward a path of violence, but one of peace. One recognizes in the beloved community the recognition of pain and conflict, but seeks to work through the differences of those that think differently than one another. The beloved community is always working for a path of justice, working for those that are hurt and harmed by society in some way, recognizing that a path of peace is not always comfortable for people, but is one that's done through listening, through justice, and through compassion. Now, when Ezekiel was speaking to the people and saying, "I think we need to reimagine God in a whole new way," I'm sure there were those in that group that said, "Ezekiel, you have no idea what you're talking about. You saw some crazy vision by the river. That's just you. That's not how God is. I know how God works. I know how God functions." And there are probably others in that group of believers that said, "Tell me more. I want to know more about what you saw. Even if you can't fully describe it, tell me what you saw because it seems interesting and inviting and something new and different that I want to be a part of." And Ezekiel, as a prophet, had to offer up a word amongst conflicting souls of how to navigate a future. If there's anything that Ezekiel tells us in chapter 1, is how much there is a reliance on God. And when there are paradigm shifts, whether it's 587 BC or 2024, when there are paradigm shifts happening, we resort to personal resolution of things rather than an openness to how God might be speaking to us in this day and time and in our world. And so I urge you, as you look at the news, in many places it's depressing news. In many places it's hurtful news. This group has been marginalized. This group can't be included. This person has the right answer. This person has the right path. It seems though everyone seems to know the truth. Everyone seems to be correct. Everyone's bound to be right. I have the right path forward. We're not doing enough listening. We're not doing enough observing the world around us. And heaven knows we're not doing enough of inviting an unpredictable God into our experience to help us figure out how to get where we need to go. If we've already prepackaged God in a way that makes us feel comfortable and predictable, we have missed out on the next great adventure that God has in store for us. As soon as you think you've got it all figured out, you have frozen yourself as a person of faith. Richard Foster talked about stages of faith development. And one of the most important ones he talks about is going from the literal to the metaphorical. and how such a huge shift that is. And you can see it. It happens in between 4th and 7th grade. They go from literal thinking to metaphorical thinking. It's like, how do I process this? How do I do this? I've kind of believed this way for so long. Foster will say that in terms of the Christian faith, like 70% of the population has not moved from literal to metaphorical thinking. But we do that with everything else. We progress with every other part of our world, with science and technology. All these things that progress, medicine, all these things we've taken advantage of, and yet faith is supposed to be frozen in time. It's not a static thing. And one thing we find from Ezekiel in this grand vision of winged faced characters that's riding on wheels going left and right, up and back, is there is nothing predictable about God other than that God is consistently present to us no matter where we are, if we dare just open our eyes and ears to see and to listen again. As we don't see and listen and open our eyes and ears to the world around us, we're just going to be lighting more candles around the table because of our human foolishness. May we simply be open to the extravagance and the unpredictability of God, knowing that God should be a guide for us and not just a crutch when we need it. May it be so.